All right, hello everyone. I'm joined here with Wayne Hsiung. So you have a crazy story to share. So you're the leader of Direct Action Everywhere, correct? And
Formerly.
okay, formerly. And I've done quite a few actions with DXC, so maybe we can talk about that later. But you have a crazy story to share with this court case coming up. It's so bizarre you can't even really believe it. It sounds like it's something from The Onion or like some sort of comedy. So you were rescuing a blind beagle, and basically for that you're facing up to 16 years in prison.
Yeah, a blind beagle who was so psychotically tormented that she was spinning in a cage for hours. The entire time I was observing her for many hours, she did not stop spinning. And for taking her to the vet, I'm now facing 16 years in prison.
All right, wait. So why don't you start from the beginning? What's the whole story behind this?
Ridgeland Farms is one of the largest beagle breeding and research facilities in the nation. And going back decades, animal rights activists have been concerned about what happens inside their facility. There were internal complaints in the early 2000s about burning dogs. There were apparently employees who were concerned and unclear if it was just dead dogs they were burning or also dead or sick or dying and sick dogs. But when you have thousands and thousands of dogs being produced every year and you're throwing away sometimes up to 10%, 15% of them, because if a dog has any imperfections, they can't be used in an experiment. So if a dog has some social problems, killed. If a dog has a foot infection, killed. If a dog is blind, for sure, killed. And even employees were complaining to the USDA back in the early 2000s that the conditions are unsanitary. This is a factory farm for dogs. There was a specific complaint about burning animals. Unclear, again, what the nature of that complaint was. And unsurprisingly, when the complaint arrived in the USDA's offices, the USDA is the United States Department of Agriculture. And anyone who knows anything about the USDA knows that it is essentially an arm of the big ag industry. It's controlled by the industry. This is not an exaggeration. It's not even animal rights propaganda. It's just widely understood. The mission of the U.S. Department of Agriculture is to promote agriculture in this country. All the high-level kind of executives at the USDA are usually formerly employees and in the future will be employees of various big ag conglomerates, and it's controlled by the industry. And so this complaint arises at the USDA's offices, and they do absolutely nothing. Interestingly, at that same time, around 2005, when these complaints were coming out about Ridgeland, the USDA's own internal watchdog, an office called the Inspector General, and this is, again, not an animal rights activist, this is like their internal lawyers saying, hey, are we following the law? Are we fulfilling our mission as an organization? Called the Enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act, which is a law that supposedly protects animals in labs from horrific abuses. They called the enforcement, and this is a direct quote, basically meaningless. Just to give you one concrete example of this, in 2018, 1 year, a year in which the federal government provided an estimated $15 billion, that's B, not million, $15 billion in straight up taxpayer subsidies. So, regular citizens' money going to torture animals in labs. So $15 billion in subsidies. The total amount of fines in the industry that year was $160,000. And again, $15 billion isn't the total revenue of the industry. That's just the subsidy. That's just the money they get for free from the government, right? So we're giving them $15 billion in taxpayer money and asking them to pay $160,000 in fines for all the animal cruelty across over 100 million animals tortured in labs. So the final straw for me was in early 2017 before we decided to go on Ridgeland to check it out ourselves. So there's like a decade between these initial incidents, the Inspector General report where they say enforcement's basically meaningless, and 2017 when we decide we got to go check out Ridgeland Farms ourselves. And the final straw for me was after years of complaints and even the USDA's own internal watchdog saying, hey, this is a scam. No one's doing anything. These animals are being tortured. And again, torture is not an exaggeration. We're talking about things like radiating dogs for years until they have so many tumors in their bones that they have over 30 bone fractures by the end of the experiment. Force feeding them industrial chemicals like laundry detergent, because dogs are the most common non-rodent species used in toxicology tests, because they'll take it. You can abuse a dog and torture a dog for years and they will not fight back. They will not bite. They will not resist because they're so gentle and loving. So after years of people complaining and saying, hey, this is messed up, and your own internal watchdog is saying, you can't do this. This is a violation of federal law. You have to stop doing this. Instead of doing something about it, the government decides, let's just cover it all up. And specifically, what they did in early 2017, before we went into Ridgeland, was all of the inspections done by federal inspectors in the United States are supposedly public property. They're not the property of some corporation. But the public, in theory, has access to them. And there's even a federal statute called the Freedom of Information Act that gives us the right to all government documents, unless there's some, obviously some social security number, something like that. Private information is redacted. But otherwise, we're supposed to have access to all government documents because it's governed by the people, not by big corporations or not by big ag. And after years of complaints, instead of doing something about it, the government took down all the animal welfare records in violation of law and just said, sorry, you guys are complaining too much, so we're just going to remove them all. And the entire animal rights was like, what? You can't do this. I mean, this is a total violation of law. These are our documents. Just because the industry is complaining that people are finding out about their dirty secrets doesn't mean you can just wipe it all off the face of the planet Earth. That's what they try to do. And, litigation on these issues can take years, sometimes a decade or more. And in that decade, there would have been hundreds of millions of animals subjected to awful experiments and no one would have known about it. So we decided to both to exercise our constitutional rights and to shake up a system that was clearly broken, that we just go into Ridgeland ourselves. And that's what we did. In April 2017, I walked in with a small team of people with cameras. Our goal was to document everything we saw. And when we saw some tortured and injured dogs, we took them to the vet. And for that, I'm now facing 2 felony charges in Dane County, Wisconsin. The trial starts on March 18th.
Okay, and what are the felony charges, if you can share that?
Yeah, so it's one count of felony theft because they're alleging the dogs were worth over $2,500, which is just false. And the second is a felony count of burglary, which is breaking into a facility with the intent to commit a theft.
Okay, and when it comes to the felony theft of $2,500 per dog, that's the claim. So you mentioned earlier that these dogs are worthless if they have any defects. So if they're like very aggressive, if they have some sort of genetic defect, were any of the dogs that you rescued, supposedly worthless by the industry, like they're defective in some way where they can't be used for research?
Yeah, I don't want to give away too much of our facts, and we're still actually kind of inquiring into the facts
Okay.
as we speak because we're getting ready for trial. I will say that there's no question to me that these dogs had very serious health ailments, and we spent cumulatively, I personally spent dozens of hours of my time caring for them, everything from using antibiotic wipes to wipe down their feet, which were infected because they had been standing on feces and wire their entire lives, to trying to socialize Julie to the point that she can even walk in a straight line because Julie, the blind Beagle puppy, yeah, she lived her entire life in, approximately 3-foot wide cage. And she, yeah, it's kind of mind blowing to us. And most human beings and really most animals don't even have a way to comprehend what that life would be like. But when we took her out, she just didn't understand the concept of open space. And so, we had to teach her how to walk. She had never gone on a walk in her life. And we had to teach her how to go up the stairs, and it was especially bad because she was blind. So the world was a very kind of scary and stressful place when we first took her out, and that would have been true in a lab too. It's hard to. One of the reasons that they use dogs in these experiences is because they're very compliant and very trusting. But if a dog is psychotic because she's blind and is terrified about everything in the world because the world is very dark and scary, it's very, very hard to even keep them alive, much less to perform whatever experiments you want to perform on her. And so we probably ourselves spent, both in terms of labor hours and just actual money, I would say thousands of dollars just trying to get these dogs back into some reasonable shape.
Right. Okay. It's absolutely impossible when you went through the numbers, $15 billion, and there's only about $100,000 worth of animal welfare fines.
Mm-hmm.
And just the extent to which these dogs are being bred. You've seen for yourself, you've went into these facilities. Um, like, why is there no interest in animal welfare? It's bizarre, especially dogs. They're man's best friend. We hear about things like in China with the dog meat, farming, and everybody's up in arms. Everyone's freaking out online, but it's just bizarre to hear that there is just this sort of animal cruelty towards dogs, man's best friend. Everybody loves dogs here, and it's being swept under the rug by everybody.
Yeah. I think it has to do a lot with just the normalization of violence by systems of authority. I mean, like I know you've spoken about this a lot, and just that most human beings sort of just go along and comply when, and honestly, you're one of the people who doesn't, even within the animal rights movement, you're very willing to be a
Yeah.
dissident, which is, it's valuable. I mean, this is why I don't like when people go after you, even when I disagree with you, because I think, no, it's actually pretty valuable to have someone who disagrees, who's willing to just like say what he thinks. And that's a broader social phenomenon. And it's particularly bad when it's an authority figure, and an authority figure has the power to put you in jail. Um, there's all these just mind-blowing psychological experiments like the Stanley Milgram authority experiments, where an authority figure tells you to literally torture and kill someone. 80% of Yale students who were part of this experiment, it's now considered an unethical experiment because a lot of people, were like traumatized by their experience with this, but that figure is a little terrifying that 80% of people are willing to, when an authority figure in a lab coat told you, you have to do this, this is part of the experiment, you signed up, it's your job. So, and the experiment was just shocking people to the point that the person in the other room is like convulsing on the ground and they go silent. First, they're screaming in agony, and then they stop screaming, and you're supposed to keep shocking them. And 80% of people would keep going, when an authority figure told them. And the difference between dog meat and dog experiments is in the context of dog meat, because there's no industry and there's no $1 billion at stake in the United States, at least, the government doesn't tell us it's okay and we have to do it. While dogs in labs, the biomedical industry and the factory farming agricultural industry are some of the largest industries in the entire nation. They have billions of dollars at stake, and they're deeply entwined with the government. And the government 100% tells people these experiments are totally natural and normal, and you have to do it. And if you don't do it, you must hate human beings. You just want to let people die of cancer. And the reality is, the vast majority of these experiments are totally stupid, even if they were valid, right? There's a lot of arguments, and we could talk about the validity of some of these scientific experiments, because there are a lot of reasons what happens to a dog is not going to happen to a human being in an experiment, because they're dogs, they're not humans. But even if they are valid, the vast majority of these experiments are on the dumbest shit you could possibly imagine. So, like, do we need another artificial sweetener? Do we need another laundry detergent? Like they're testing things like, fentanyl, injecting dogs with fentanyl. It's like, all right, I mean, there are probably better interventions for fentanyl. We probably don't have to just torture and kill a bunch of dogs to see what fentanyl does to people. Why don't we just give people rehab services, or like give people more meaningful opportunities in life so they don't feel like they have to take fentanyl because they actually have a life that's worth living. But instead, we inject dogs with fentanyl and say, like, well, we have to do it because the Sacklers poisoned us all. So now we've got to solve the Sacklers problems by torturing dogs. And that literally has happened. They force dogs to get fentanyl injections and then kill them to see what happens.
Yeah. I think there's already research on animal testing, and the research basically shows when you compare outcomes with human trials, there's about a 50-50 shot whether or not the results will be comparable from an animal model to a human model. So
Yeah.
a lot of this research is just nonsense to begin with. So there's not really any kind of validity to it, but even if there were, I think there has to be a conversation about whether or not it's ethical to just take these innocent animals that have no ability to consent and subject them to just insane, outrageous torture.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, that's totally right. And I think there are two things I'd add. One is it's particularly abhorrent that we continue using these techniques because we have new technologies that are more promising, like organ on a chip or cell cultures, which are actually based on human models,
Yeah.
like they're actual real human cells. So we could use this organism that has completely different DNA than us. I mean, granted, same consciousness, they have sentience, but in terms of just the biological mechanics, I mean, like dogs are different species, or we can use cells that are actually from our species. But your second point is important too, because this is controversial. I do think there are some things that animal experiments or the use of animals in biomedical science would actually help humans on. And I think they're still wrong. I'll give you an
Yeah.
example. For a long time, until very recently, insulin was actually taken from pigs. They would selectively breed and sometimes even genetically engineer pigs to have particular types of insulin, and then they'd give that insulin to diabetics, and it would actually work. And so for us to say like, hey, this isn't valid, it's like, well, no, I mean, those people actually did take insulin that was extracted from pigs, and it actually did reduce their sugar levels, and it did actually, stop them from dying. The bigger point is just these are independent living creatures of interest, and we don't have the right to take their lives any more than like if I was suffering from kidney failure, which millions, not millions, thousands of Americans die of kidney failure every day. I can't just go around murdering people and taking their kidneys. And I can't justify that by saying, well, I'm sorry you don't consent to this, but like I just needed to save myself. It's like, no, that's part of having an ethical society is realizing I cannot dominate you, even when my interests are at stake, that you have interests too, and it's not right for me to just decide my interests are more important than yours and kill you to save myself.
Yeah. I'm sure you've heard of the name the trait argument. If we were talking about trait equalized humans, so humans that basically had the same level of sentience and consciousness and intelligence as, these dogs that are being used in the laboratory, we wouldn't be okay with experimenting on humans like that are, like mentally disabled.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And there are human beings like that. There are mentally disabled human beings that have far less intelligence than a dog. And there are infants, for example, that have far less intelligence than a dog. And if you said, oh, I'm just going to like kill a bunch of infants and extract their insulin, people are like, what is wrong with you? Are you out? Are you out of your mind? That is some dystopian horror movie. This is not, you can't be serious about killing all these, 2-year-old, 3-year-old children. And if someone said, oh, don't worry, they're not smart. It's like, this is you're like literally a Nazi. I mean, this is disgusting what you're saying. But we make those same arguments for dogs and pigs and other animals, and we don't even bat an eye, and it doesn't make any sense. It's
Yeah.
like totally morally um, inconsistent with our positions with respect to human beings who have those cognitive disabilities.
Yeah, even if you could make a legitimate argument that these dogs are being used for some sort of, useful endeavor that benefits humans, it still doesn't justify what they do. And to make things even more ridiculous, in all likelihood, they're not being used for anything useful other than just
Yeah,
straight up torture. Um,
yeah.
so I know the trial's coming up, and you might not want to talk about the court case too much. I'd be in there personally, but what do you feel like the prosecutor, like, what do you feel like they think about this? Because I've had my fair share of court cases, and I've had to communicate with prosecutors, and I've been in a situation where they thought the whole circumstances were ridiculous, and they went,
Hmm.
easier on me. So what's the kind of sense that you get from the prosecutor and how they feel about this whole situation?
Most prosecutors in the United States, and I would guess around the world, are focused primarily on doing their job. I think there are times where they have moral qualms about doing their job, but I think those times are rare, and they usually involve situations where there is not a lot of pressure for them to do their job, even when they think their job is wrong. Um, so I think if this case were just a one-off case involving a dog uh, who was taken from his home, who was tortured, and a complaining witness who said, "Hey, they took my dog," I think most prosecutors. I mean, first of all, the case would not be brought. But secondly, even if it were brought, the cross would be like, "Oh my God, this is so annoying and frustrating. This is such a stupid case," and they'd probably basically let us off pretty lightly because they don't understand. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there that's wrong. This is not on my list of priorities. The difference here is that the biomedical industry is incredibly powerful, and they're asking for deterrence. They want a long sentence to punish us because they don't want people doing this work because they know first of all, it exposes the things that the industry is trying to cover up. But I think the greatest danger is that they've actually started seeing that more people are doing it. I think both the biomedical and the factory farming industry, which are aligned, especially on animal issues, have been very, very concerned about these mass open rescues where we have hundreds of people, because when you have that large a number of people, it no longer can be written off as a couple of weird vegans. And the amount of not just physical disruption, because I think the physical disruption is less important than the cultural disruption that can be caused by hundreds of people occupying a facility that's exploiting animals non-violently, peacefully, and saying, this has got to stop, and we're going to stop it. That starts feeling like a political threat far beyond just losing a couple dogs. That starts feeling like a political movement. And so I think the reality is for these prosecutors, when their bosses, and every district attorney in the state of Wisconsin, as with most district attorneys across the nation, is an elected official who has to campaign and get money largely from big corporations and industries to win office. When a line prosecutor is just kind of you've got the head prosecutor who runs the entire office, and you got prosecutors assigned to particular cases, and that's a line prosecutor. A line prosecutor is going to hear from their boss, we need to go hard after this. You have to do a good job, and we need a conviction and a serious sentence, because my boss, the corporation that's funding my campaigns, is telling me we need deterrence. And again, most people at their jobs don't really think twice about this. They're worried about their kids, their college funds. They're worried about, getting a promotion next year. And this is one of the great failings of our species. There's not enough kind of deep internal reflection as to whether the things we're doing are wrong or right. And we see that with just veganism more generally. And we see that in these cases too, that when there's a lot of pressure on someone to do the wrong thing, they often don't even think, much less do the right thing.
Right. So how can people support you with this whole court case? Because it does seem, I've seen other cases that you've been involved in, and you've done a great job, I'd say, for the whole animal rights movement. And how can people support you with this?
Can I just first say thanks for saying that?
Yeah, no problem.
I appreciate that, because you've got a powerful voice, and I know your audience is among the most committed vegans just out there, and I imagine non-vegans too. I'm guessing there are people who listen to you who are curious and interested. This might be surprising, but I think the most important they can do is just find something in your local community. I'm not saying, by all means, share our stuff. This interview is going to reach a lot of people, and I'm really grateful for that. And on March 18th, we do have a day of action where people can just tweet out Beagle to trail. I mean, that's the framing that we're currently planning on using on March 18th, the first day of trial, just trying to highlight to the entire world that, did you know that the most trusting species of animal and the most trusting breed within that species is being brutally tortured, sometimes for years, precisely because they're trusting and gentle, and this is happened to literally millions of animals, millions of beagles over the last 30 years. But probably the most important thing, and I was recently in jail, and I could be in jail again, and potentially for quite longer period of time. But the thing that definitely made not just me, but I know the other defendants and lawyers feel good, is just feeling like the movement's strong. So the thing I hope people take from this, and the thing they can do to support me, and more importantly, support Julie, because she is the one they targeted. Like, if not for the infinitesimally small stroke of luck, like it just impossible odds, she would be dead now, and probably would have gone through enormous anguish her entire life, because powerful people did not give a shit about her feelings. And now she's in a very happy place. But there's a Julie in that facility that we could have taken who did not get out. And the way we're going to get her out is for everybody to challenge themselves a little and push a little further to try and help animals. And I'm not saying everyone has to go break into a lab or a farm and rescue animals. Although, I mean, if you do that, all the more power to you. I'm fully supportive. And in particular, I want to help you and help you argue that it's legally right to do so, not just morally, but legally right. And that's the big picture of these cases. We want this to be a precedent for the right to rescue, and more broadly for the idea that animals are persons and not just things. But the most impactful thing that folks can do to support me and the animals is finding the thing that you're passionate about, but not being afraid, because there's all these forces around you that are pressuring you not to do and say the things that you actually think. And when we started DXC, a lot of people have been confused about what DXC was actually about, because it's done a lot of weird stuff over the years, and some of it good, some of it probably not so good. But fundamentally, it was about finding your voice. We thought there was a large number of people out there who did think that animals were being exploited, and they're, whether because of social pressure or threats of the workforce or whatever, or even just pressure from your family, they were not speaking out. And like the number one thing we need to do is find our voice and challenge ourselves a little bit and realize, just as the animals are going through enormous fear every single day of their lives. I mean, Julie was in such terror, and so many of these dogs, because they're just in these alien, scary places, and they never have a friend. They never have any of the things that we rely on to keep ourselves safe, including non-human animals. I mean, like my dog is one of the things that makes me happiest in the world. Like I come home, and no matter how shitty my day was, no matter how much of an asshole everyone around me was, I know my dog will love me. None of these animals ever have that. They never have that. And that's one of the worst things about all these forms of exploitation. They never have a friend. That's just evil. Like anyone who has a dog knows how much they want friends. And the fact that this Beagle never had a friend. So they live through fear every single day of their lives. They through anxiety, isolation, all the most awful things that we have to go through times 1,000. And we have to push ourselves to feel a little bit that bit about ourselves. So, my request to everyone is challenge yourself a little bit. Push yourself a little bit to give a little more for the animals. And that could be contributing a little more financially. It could be going out to protest even though you're scared. It could be starting a YouTube channel like you did, whatever it is, like push yourself a little more to help animals. And as long as the movement's growing, if I'm sitting in a cage, I won't, maybe I won't be happy because it's an unpleasant experience to be in jail, but I'll feel like, all right, this is worth it because I can see the movement growing. And that gives me a sense of purpose. And I know that there's a Julie out there that's going to be saved because someone out there is going to hear the story and go rescue a dog themselves.
All right. Why don't we talk about DXC and some of your history with DXC? I've done a fair number of activist events with DXC. A few years ago, there was we went into a steakhouse, and we were talking about how meat is murder. That got a lot of media attention. I was actually surprised.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was talking about that. It was on the news. It was on the radio. For the DXC events that I've been a part of, I've enjoyed most of them. I think a lot of them had a really positive outcome. A lot of people kind of make fun of vegans for going into a steakhouse and yelling, and it might feel kind of embarrassing for a lot of people to do something that's kind of out there, and you're in a space with a bunch of strangers and you're yelling at them. It's kind of weird, but from how I've seen people react to, these sorts of, these forms of outreach, it seems to be pretty positive. Somebody has to go out there and, mention that, something's wrong. If you don't do things like this, what's going to change? So, so how did you start DXC and what was your sort of goal with it?
Yeah, DXC started in 2012 and became a real thing in 2013. And there was initially, when our conversations, no particular tactic or strategy, even though DXC has become most known for disruption. I mean, when we started having conversations about DXC, we talked about, hey, maybe we should start doing education schools. Maybe we should hand out more vegan cookies. I mean, literally, you name the tactic, we discussed it as a possibility. And there were two things that are fundamental to our conversations over time. And this is me, Priya Sahani, who's one of the co-founders of DXC, Vonnie Rose, Chris Van Breen, a number of other individuals who were just hanging out, vegans in the Bay Area hanging out. And the two fundamental things we decided we all converged around were, one, we need a network that just empowers people to do whatever they want to do. And like, there's just so much infighting within the movement and people bashing each other and telling each other, especially tactically, like your tactic doesn't work, our tactic doesn't work. My view is, as long as the tactic is nonviolent, we should be supporting it. I don't care what you're doing. If you're doing nonviolent activism, there's so little activism out there in the world, and none of us know what's going to work. It's every movement in history has used all sorts of weird tactics that in retrospect, you might think that was weird. I can't believe that worked. The gay rights movement, they put a huge condom on Jesse Helms' house when he was opposed to support for LGBTQ folks during the AIDS crisis. You might think that's kind of one of the wildest things I've ever heard. And that sounds kind of super offensive and weird and also just kind of creepy and sexual to put a condom, like a giant condom on someone's home. Ended up being a very positive action and got a lot of attention. And a lot of people just laughed and said, this prude is stopping people from getting condoms, and literally people are dying as a result from AIDS. So it worked. And who knows? Who would have known that was right? So the first thing was we said, look, we just need to build a network that supports activism, that helps people find their voice, right? And like the 10 words we sort of settled on as the mantra of DXE, which it's become a little less, DXE is in different hands, in many ways, much better hands. Almira Tanner is the new lead organizer, elected leader of the organization, has done a fantastic job. But the original 10 words we really started with were find your friends, or find your voice, find some friends, and fight like hell. That's it. If you do that, you're part of DXE. If you're finding your voice, you're finding some friends to exercise your voice with, and you're fighting like hell, then you're part of DXE. And by fighting, we meant nonviolent fighting, obviously. That was crucial too. But the other thing that we realized all of us were really, really inspired by, which it actually took us 2 years from those initial conversations to actually launch this, was open rescue. Because in 2012, the movement was in such a state of fear in the United States because of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which made a lot of people scared that even going out there and doing leafleting or doing a peaceful protest could lead to a federal terrorism allegation against you. And in particular, a guy by the name of Adam Duran had gone to jail for openly rescuing a hen. And when he went to jail, at the time, everyone in the movement thought, there's no chance someone could go to jail for this. I mean, that's ridiculous. Like, he's exposing the conduct of a factory farm, and it's just going to bring even more attention if they try and jail him. Surely they're not going to try and jail him. They did. And he got a near maximum sentence, 6 months. And he ended up getting out in a month because of various procedural defects, but it was really scary, and open rescue basically stopped. But I think there was actually a meeting. I still remember the meeting. We were at Ronnie Rose's house in San Jose, and we're all debating, just shooting the shit, trying to decide what we want to do. We're all like, hey, the movement's not growing. There's not much of a grassroots force behind this. I don't even remember who said it, but I definitely remember I repeated it if someone else said it initially. But someone just basically said, you know what, we're talking about all these complicated strategies and social scientific research and all this stuff that's all seems very removed from the problem. What we really need to do is just kick the doors down and start taking the animals out. And everyone just looked around and like, yeah, I mean, what that person said, that actually seems right. And that's not just some kind of comic book line. There's actually social scientific research to back this, that what you need to do when you're trying to change the world is embody that change. I mean, this is literally what Gandhi meant when he said, be the change. He said, if we think we have the right to harvest salt from the beaches, even though the British said we can't do it, let's just do it. I mean, if we think we have the right to take this salt because it's our land, I mean, why can these people from a country 7,000 miles away tell us not to take salt from our own land because they have a corporation that's telling us, no, that's our salt now? It's like, you just came into our country and told us we can't take salt from our own land. That's ridiculous. So they just did it. And they got arrested, they got beaten, some of them got killed. Gandhi was in jail for like 6 years, but he changed the world just by doing the thing he thought the world should do. And every one of us, I mean, when we watch these videos, whether it's footage from a lab or from a factory farm, like the number one thing all of us want is just to help the animals. And that's not wrong any more than Gandhi harvesting salt from his own land. Like, how can you tell someone just because of the color of his skin, just because he's Indian, not white, and just because he's not a citizen of Britain, that he can't take salt? That's ridiculous. Like, this is his land. And, racism is wrong. You can't just tell someone they can't take salt because they're Indian rather than white. And similarly, how can you tell someone that it's wrong to take a sick dog to the vet or a starving piglet, give her food? And if we really believe that's the world we want to create, where we've normalized compassion and care for animals instead of tormenting these poor creatures, just do it. And I mean, and I'm not saying there isn't a lot of strategy and legal chicanery that you have to engage in, and a lot of complicated work that needs to be done. There is a lot of work, but on a very, very basic level, I think the animal rights movement just needs to start acting as if the world believes in animal rights already. And if we do that, the world will start believing it.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Is there anything else you want to talk about when it comes to the case or activism just in general?
Is there anything you want to talk about? I mean, your audience better than me.
Yeah,
there's billions of things I could talk about.
So, I've had issues with the activist community, primarily because of the intrusion of what I'd call radical intersectional feminism. A lot of these people have just created problems. Um, I think you've met him personally, Darren Chang, one of my most
Yeah,
hated
I've met
enemies
Darren.
on the planet Earth. He has started bullcrap with other activists, and I've seen other people who identify as intersectional feminists do the same thing. They promote racism against Jews. They go out of their way to attack Jews in the activist movement who are Zionists. False allegations against men. I've seen quite a bit of that personally. Some of them being personal friends of mine. Not doing vegan activism and instead doing things like talking about how indigenous people's land was taken away, or just talking about human specific issues like Black Lives Matter, and not really involving the animals and doing what you're supposedly supposed to be doing with animal rights, talking about animal rights. I've seen so many of these issues where people are just not focusing on you know the actual bigger picture and focusing on animal rights, and then they just create all of these interpersonal problems. Even though they claim to be against racism and sexism, they're the ones really being the most racist and sexist in the organization, particularly ostracizing straight white men. Have you seen a bit of that yourself?
I do know Darren. And Darren, last conversation I had with him was in Canada. I'm no longer allowed in Canada, unfortunately, because I'm a convicted felon. And Darren was very unhappy with me, and as I know he is with you. Um, but I'm going to push back on what you said. I think Darren's a good guy. I think he means well, and I think he's caught up in a sentiment we're seeing on both the right and the left, where movements are eating their own alive. This is happening on the right too. It's not just a left wing problem. So I don't think it's a problem just of intersectionality. And I do believe in intersectionality. A different version than Darren believes in for sure. Because I've read about this, but intersectionality should be a sentiment of inclusion, not exclusion. It should be used as a shield, not as a sword. And too often people, and it's often very privileged people. It's people who go to fancy universities and have a lot of wealth use intersectionality to condemn and exclude people. And I've said this to people behind the scenes many times. Like, to me, using intersectionality to exclude someone like you, I mean, I know you don't tout it, but you're not a very common face. There are not many people of color in this movement. You also just have different political perspectives. And I'm not saying people are, race is the same as political ideology in terms of targeting. I think historically people have been people have been targeted for the political ideology too. I mean, you look at all like the Red Scare and all these terrifying episodes where if you have the wrong ideology, people literally kill you. I mean, it happened to a lot of my family members in China. Like, the Cultural Revolution is something everyone should know about in activism, because that's an example of a movement that went really, really wrong. Uh, Probably a good movement originally that was trying to fight for the working class, prevent rich people from terrorizing everyone in the country of China, and led to the greatest mass murder in history. The most Americans don't know about, most people in Canada don't know about, read about it, because Mao was probably the biggest killer in history, and it was bloodshed that all started with very good intentions. But what happened was, there's this ideological sentiment where if you're not completely aligned with me, you're a threat, and I'm going to exterminate you. And they literally did that. And I see that happening in the United States on both sides of the movement. And that's not the way. If you actually believe in inclusivity, compassion, and justice, that's not the sort of approach you should be taking. But that's not just a historical sentiment. There's actually been some relatively recent research on intersectional framing. So there's a paper in the American Political Science Review by some Black political scientists who are studying Black Lives Matter and trying to understand, okay, if we're trying to stop police brutality against Black people and the mass incarceration of Black people in this country, which is a huge problem, I don't see how anyone can look at the data and say, hey, there seems to be some racism in law enforcement in the United States, and particularly targeting Black and Black people especially. And I'm not saying it's exactly what the left says, because the left likes, like most movements, like to exaggerate things and distort things in certain ways. But there is a problem. There is a huge problem with racism in law enforcement. So they're trying to test, okay, what's the best way to actually convince people to support this? Should we just talk about police brutality, or we talk about police brutality and feminism and abortion and trans justice in the same message? And it could go either way. It's ultimately an empirical question, because you might think, oh, if you talk about all these other things, then the people who care about abortion and trans justice will jump on board your campaign against police brutality. And that's not what they find. Instead, they find when you make an ask and say, like, okay, we're concerned about police brutality, and also we're concerned about trans justice and abortion, all these other things, there's significantly lower participation rates in campaigns. And this is true through most of movement history. I mean, I've talked to some of the fathers of social movement theory, like Doug McAdam at Stanford. He said the same thing. If you go back and look at the gay rights movement or the anti-war movement or even the civil rights movement, when you have like 1,000 different issues, you can't focus on any one. And it becomes a litmus test where none of us is perfect on every issue. None of us is aligned on every issue. And if we expect everyone to be aligned on every issue, we're eventually going to have movements of one people. Every single movement in the entire world will just be me. Because one of the really special things about each of us on this planet is each of us is the only one of us. And if we expect everyone to agree with us on everything, that is a movement of one person, right? And so movements have to find ways to compromise, to work together across a broader set of people. Specifically with Darren, I think one of the really valuable things about these court cases is one of the reasons I think people like Darren end up focusing on what seem like fairly small, differences of opinion within the animal rights movement is the stakes are very small for us for the most part. Most of us as human beings are kind of like, there's some stakes, people like us or they don't like us, or activism or effective or not active. But if we fail and if our movement sucks, we don't go into a cage for the most part. And actually, one of the really nice things about these court cases is the stakes suddenly increase for the activists, right? Because when I'm facing prison time, suddenly all of the small little interpersonal grievances that people have within DXC, within the movement, they become a lot smaller by comparison. And that's a way for us to leverage kind of our stakes, our freedom, to get the entire movement to focus on the freedom of animals. And so, at the same time that I was incarcerated, there was apparently some hit piece that came out about me alleging abuse of power, retaliation, sexual harassment, all of it false. And typically I think that would have actually really, probably most of your listeners have no idea this even happened because I was in jail and no one gave it down. And even the people who read the article were like, this is stupid. This guy's in jail. And you're talking about how, he supposedly retaliated against someone and the factual allegations all seem very confusing. It's like, this seems like a waste of time. And it became very obvious to people that it was a waste of time because there was something more serious that everyone was talking about, namely the fact that human beings and animals are in cages.
Yeah, you mentioned how with intersectionalism, you end up with this problem where you keep adding to the sort of social problems that you want to tackle. So it's not just black rights; it's also trans rights, it's also abortion, it's also this and that, and it kind of requires people to all agree. You have to agree with every single one of these political messages. And when you keep adding these messages on, you're decreasing the likelihood of finding people who agree with this message, this message, this message. That in itself is a problem, but I think these sorts of things are very attractive to narcissists. So narcissists will always try to blame others. They'll always try to get power over other people. They'll always try to make themselves seem superior in some way. They always have to feel like they're better than everybody else. So when you have a situation where you can sort of weaponize these ideas of, if you're not, in favor of black rights, trans rights, feminism, all these other things, well, I'm better than you. This is something that I can use against you to call you a bigot. This is something that I can use to exclude certain people that are a threat to me and a threat to my social status. So I think this intersectional thing, it really attracts narcissists, people with antisocial personality disorders into the movement. And I totally disagree with you about Darren Chang. You say he's a good guy. I think he's, to the core, just an awful piece of crap. I think he has some sort of antisocial personality disorder, probably narcissism, maybe sociopathy or something like that. And I've seen a fair bit of that in the movement, where there are clearly people with some sort of antisocial personality disorder deliberately weaponizing these sorts of political concepts like intersectionalism to, again, make themselves feel superior, to exclude people that are a threat to their social status.
Yeah. Yeah, was Darren part of the campaign to like ban you from Save and stuff or
Yeah,
something like that? I don't even remember
yeah,
the exact. Yeah, and that actually worked, right? They did ban you.
yeah, yeah. Basically,
Yeah, which is I think that's wrong, and I'd tell Anita that. I love Anita too. So say you're right about Darren. I don't think you are. I mean he's gone after me too. Like he left DXE in a big huff and because he was an organizer for DXE and then decided we were anti-indigenous, anti-black, anti-feminist. The laundry list of complaints that were. I mean honestly, it's just too long for me to
he's not even an
remember it
animal
all.
rights activist. Have you seen his? Have you seen the article and interview he did about supporting the seal hunt because
Mm,
he was supporting the seal hunt in Canada.
yeah, that's unconscionable.
Yeah, because he said it goes against Native American rights, and who are we as white colonists to tell them what to do? He's not an animal rights activist. Again,
Yeah.
I only see somebody who's a narcissist doing something like that.
But say he does have some sort of kind of anti. He either is a person who is suffering from some sort of, even clinical, social or mental issue, or even just has been broken by our society. And you're right, there are a lot of broken people, and I know this because I think you've talked about this a little bit, but I'm also kind of broken. I'm a lot better than I was, but part of the reason I became an animal rights activist is because I suffered severely from depression for many, many years. And I felt disconnected from society. And there's something that allows you to take more risks and just do things that other people aren't willing to do when you're broken. Because it's like, well, everything's fucking broken. So who cares? I can just do what I think. I can do whatever I believe. And that's literally how I started openly rescuing animals because I was so broken that I just thought, who cares? I mean, everything else sucks. But say Darren does some sort of like antisocial, has some sort of antisocial personality disorder. And I mean, I hate even talking about it this way because I haven't talked to him in many years and I do like him, even though he's not a big fan of mine. But like to me, and this is like a mental shift that I went through about 15 years ago. Say he's just an animal, like a dog. I've dealt with dogs who are extremely aggressive my entire life. Like I fell in love with pit bulls many, many years ago. And there are a lot of pit bulls, sometimes by birth. It's often due to socialization and they had like shitty families that taught them to be aggressive. But sometimes there are pit bulls that are just kind of genetically aggressive. And this is a little controversial, but I think it's true. And I've dealt with a lot of pit bulls, so I think I've got a sufficient sample to know. Primarily aggressive towards other dogs. They tend not to be too aggressive towards humans. In fact, like in dog fighting, there's this mantra: "Man killers die." Like they literally will kill pit bulls that target human beings. So pit bulls are actually not that aggressive to humans, but they have been bred to attack other dogs, and some of them are just like vicious. And I had a dog like this. I've dealt with many dogs, and just say Darren has some sort of aggressive personality. Like I think he's just an animal. He's been broken by the system, and while there are a lot of narcissists in the movement, I agree with that. I don't think it's their fault. I think we've created a culture that breeds narcissism. And so people will become narcissistic in this society. I think the left has, for most of the last decade and even longer than that, celebrated and lionized people who, self-victimize and target others in these like circular firing squads of leftist persecution. And so, of course, people are going to become narcissistic when you become cool and everyone loves you and everyone likes your comments when you're narcissistic. And it's kind of on all of us to change the culture and see when someone's like acting the way Darren has sometimes, instead of like being too scared to say something about it. If you're his friend, and I was his friend at one point, and I tried to be this person. I didn't do a very good job of it because obviously, he didn't change his approach. But, I should have done a better job confronting Darren when he went after you. And I don't think I did, so that's on me. But other people should have too, and taught Darren, hey, oh, there's a puppy behind you.
Yeah, yeah, it's fair.
We all should have just like reshaped the movement norms so that sort of behavior wasn't tolerated. But instead, it's not even that it's not tolerated, it's actually elevated. People celebrate that sort of behavior. And again, we're social animals. We're going to do what everyone celebrates. And that's been celebrated behavior. I do think something's changing now. In the last 10 years, I've seen a lot of people on the left even recognize that, hey, this is not working. This is just tearing ourselves apart. Like we have to find a different way of trying to address these conflicts. And the Israeli-Palestine conflict, as awful as it's been, and I think Jeremy told me you've been embroiled in some of these disputes too, as have I. It's like been so intense on all sides. All these people just attacking and hating. This is another example that is teaching everyone on the left that, hey, we gotta have to approach these things differently. This has not been working for the animals or for us. So that's my hope, that all these recent incidents of super intense conflict, including people like Darren, will teach all of us to build a better culture.
Yeah, I definitely think it is a problem, and I don't know if it can really be solved. A lot of people aren't really standoffish and willing to confront other people, like you know me. I'll just go after anybody if I think there's a problem with them. Most people aren't like that, and these people with antisocial personality disorders, narcissists, sociopaths, they're extremely good at manipulating. So I don't know if this is a problem that can necessarily be fixed aside from just trying to, recognize the signs and ostracize these people and get intersectionality the fuck out of our movement. I think it is absolutely toxic, and that ideology is especially attractive to narcissists. I think activist communities kind of attract people with those antisocial personality disorders to begin with. I think they make up something like 1 or 2% of the population. I wouldn't be surprised if that would jump up to maybe 5 or 10% in some of these activist orgs. And when you involve intersectionality in these things where people can weaponize it as a means of increasing their social status, power over other people, getting rid of people who are a threat to their sort of social order, it just creates an even bigger problem for activism. So yeah, people do definitely need to stand up against people who are creating problems in our movement and say, hey, it's wrong to kick this guy out because he disagrees with this or that, or because you have a personal problem with him. But I just don't have enough faith that people will really be able to be that confrontational. And we really just need to get rid of intersectionality away from veganism. It's just being a complete, total cancer.
Yeah, I had a conversation. I don't know if he wants to be mentioned because he's in a much more mainstream organization, but I had a conversation recently with a leader in the European animal rights movement about the European movement. The European movement is based the same sorts of issues, like intense infighting over largely these leftist identity issues. And one thing that you said that he also said is we actually have to be a little more confrontational, and especially early on, instead of letting issues, and especially if you're someone who's on the sidelines seeing something you think is like, oh man, this is like too much. Why are they kind of reacting this way to relatively minor disagreement? Like everybody kind of wants to run away. And that's, again, you can understand why, because who wants to get into that, that frying pan? That's like terrifying. But we all have to challenge ourselves to be that person. And so what he said is we actually try to build a culture within our organization or broadly in the European movement where we escalate things quickly. It's kind of the opposite,
Yeah.
it's that Will Ferrell clip from Man Command. That escalated quickly, and you normally don't escalate things quickly. But the research on good communities and organizations shows that you go towards the uncomfortable conversations. You can't run from them.
Yeah.
You've got to go towards them. You've got to talk these things out. And just whether it's sexual harassment, race, Israel, Palestine, I think we should talk about these things more, because one of the things that makes these issues so toxic is the fact that everyone's scared. And just by virtue of going towards uncomfortable conversations, I mean, it's not that different from working out. I know you work out a lot, and you know that, like a 50-pound barbell might seem very challenging when you first do a bench press. Like 2 50-pound barbells are actually, that's probably a lot for people. Even 2 20-pound barbells is a lot of people. But you do it enough, and then suddenly you're shooting for 400 like and you can do 310 times. It becomes less uncomfortable the more you do it. And the same is true of psychological discomfort. Like the more we can confront it, the more we will be able to overcome some of the problems. The one thing I'll push back on you on is, let's just set aside the word intersectionality, because I think it's just a buzzword. It's mostly used by elites and privileged people. I think actual working class people, actual poor people, people of color who are suffering various forms of oppression have never even heard of this concept. What I like about intersectionality is just the idea that I don't care what your background is, we need to be giving you a voice and a role in this movement. If you're Black, if you're Muslim, if you're gay, if you're trans, whatever it is, we know there have been periods of time in American history, for example, where literally, I'm of a race that was literally excluded from this country until the 1960s. They had a law in the book called the Chinese Exclusion Act. you're of a race that was once enslaved in this country, right? So there is a pattern of certain people, and the movement is pretty white. Like, and that's not white people's fault necessarily, you know, and but it is good for us to say, like, hey, let's be inclusive. You know, just because someone is different from us doesn't mean we shouldn't engage with them and be friendly to them and welcome them to the movement. And I think that's a valuable thing for the movement to think about,
Well,
right?
inclusivity is great, but that's separate to intersectionality. That's a different concept.
It
Intersectionality
doesn't have
is
to be. Yeah, I think
well, again, intersectionality is something more specific. I think we can all agree that inclusivity is a good idea, but again, intersectionality has created issues where it has made people, push towards exclusivity. So many people are getting excluded because of these intersectional ideologies.
yeah. Yeah, I mean it's a fair point, and I stopped using the term intersectionality because I think it's become so loaded, and I think it's become more of a sword. Like I said, there's a difference
Yeah.
between intersectionality being used as a sword and being used as a shield. If you're trying to protect yourself and say like, hey, you know, I just because I'm trans doesn't mean I don't get a vote or I can't participate. You know, and there are people who are going to be uncomfortable just because someone's trans in the room. Like, and we should say, no, look, I mean, we're trying to argue that because a class of beings is different doesn't mean their interests don't matter. We cannot exclude this person because we think their interests don't matter because they're different from us. So whatever feelings you have about trans people, like, let's get over them and let them be a part of this movement because the movement's going to be stronger if we include everyone. But I'm with you. When it's used as a sword to cut the movement down, one of the ironclad rules of social movements is you need more people. And if you're cutting people out of the movement left and right, you know, you're not going to have the people you need to actually create change.
Well, I think that is sort of, you've seen what is basically a natural outcome of intersectionality. I've talked about this. I did a speech about this before where there's an academic definition of intersectionality and there's a sort of colloquial definition of intersectionality. And what these intersectional activists have done is they've taken the academic, they've gone so far away from the academic definition. The academic definition is pretty basic. It basically just outlines that people can experience oppression in different ways given different like racial or social classes. So a black woman will experience racism differently than a black man. Just because they're also a female. And these other forms of oppression like sexism can intersect racism. Now, what these intersectional activists have done is they've come up with this idea that all forms of oppression are interlinked, which is very different from, this original concept. So if you aren't in favor of black rights, if you're not in favor of women's rights, if you're not vegan, if you're not pro-trans, if you're not anti-abortion, all these different things, if you're not pro-Palestine, then you're an oppressor, you have to be ostracized. And that's the ideology that's being promoted by people like Darren Chang, like, Anita Krantz from CowSave. And we've already talked about this earlier. That sort of idea ostracizes people because now they've created this ideology where you have to be on board with every single thing or else you have to be gone because you're an oppressor.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that's roughly what I've experienced from Darren. And I just think that's a wrong philosophy.
Yeah.
I don't think that's what Anita thinks. And I think she's made mistakes, as have I, in organizing. But I think Anita is someone who's trying to do the right thing, is facing lots of pressures from a lot of different, both internal and external stakeholders. And I've had conversations with her about this. Like, I don't want to give away too much of those personal details because I don't think she'd want me to.
Sure.
But I know there's no doubt that she's done a lot of really good things for animals. The Save movement has been really powerful, getting people to bear witness. She faced a criminal trial and was nearly incarcerated and won the trial for giving water to pig. Beautiful, inspiring work.
She's done great things, and
she has. But the one of the reasons she does things like ban you is because she's feeling so much pressure, and she thinks all that good work for animals is going to disappear unless I ban someone like Richard.
Well, I
disagree.
I think that's fundamentally she's a good person, and I think she's being manipulated by people like Darren Chang. And again, that's why I think this intersectionality bullcrap just needs to be excised from the movement entirely. Because
so you place Darren and Anita in different camps.
Yeah.
In this regard, totally. Like Anita is a good. Yeah. they are different. Like Anita is not fundamentally an aggressive person, in my view, who's trying to like. I don't think Darren's necessarily trying to hurt people, but he's definitely trying to undermine people. He does see his goal is, for example, to get people banned. Well, she doesn't really. That's not her life. She doesn't want to have to do those sorts of things. She's doing it because of pressure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
But at least for me personally, for what I've dealt with activism, I think that's been the biggest issue, at least in the Toronto activist scene. And
yeah,
I've heard out in the West Coast, like in BC, it's also been a big issue too.
yeah. You know, it's funny. I'm pretty sure I met you at a Save Vigil. Do
Did
you
you?
remember this? Yeah, I think
I
met you
can't
at a
actually
Save Vigil.
remember.
So Anita is the reason we know each other. Yeah. So that's the irony of it. And then, yeah, I'm pretty sure I met you at a Save Vigil that you attended, and I attended too. And then a couple of years later, I think you were banned. Which, again, I think it was the wrong choice. But I will also say, having been in a position where I was, quote unquote, leading a lot of people, I've banned people, and I'm sure some of the bans I had were mistakes. So it's easy for me to judge and say, and I do think this. I think it was clearly a mistake to ban you personally, but I have no idea what her internal stakeholders were saying to her, and I have no idea what pressure she was facing, and so it's hard. And did you still have a personal relationship with her? Can you talk to her?
No, she doesn't communicate with me anymore.
Yeah, I think that's messed up, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I'll reach out to her and tell her I had a good conversation. I mean, if you want me to, if you don't want me to, I think she should, because I think you're a super smart guy. You obviously have a following, and people trust what you say about things. And it doesn't help the Save movement that you're not able to participate in their work, in my view. So even from
yeah.
her personal interest, I think she should change her mind. But
Like
I don't
I'm
know.
moving away
I
from
mean, not that I have any
Toronto
sway.
in the next week, so I don't think it'll be really too
Oh,
big of a deal anyway. It's not like I'm
okay.
gonna be in Toronto anymore, but you can if you want. I
Yeah, I'll do
mean,
it.
yeah,
I like just bringing good people together. So I'll reach out there.
yeah,
And now that I'm facing felony trial, I mean, one of the nice things about facing felony trial, people respond to your emails because they're like,
yeah,
just
I
because
guess.
they feel bad for you.
Yeah, yeah,
They're like, all right, this guy's going to possibly face jail time. I guess I should probably respond to his email. But
yeah. All
so I'll reach
right.
out there for sure.
Anything else you kind of wanted to bring up or talk about before we end things?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'll say is these court cases were something we anticipated. So I'm not saying it's not scary, and it's going to totally suck if I'm in jail for even a day, much less 16 years. Although I think 16 years or even somewhere near there is probably unlikely. But I also thought it was pretty unlikely I'd be convicted at all in Sonoma, and I got convicted. And,
Yeah,
and like the Shack kids, we thought that was pretty unlikely. All their lawyers were telling them, there's no way they're going to put you in prison. They got like 5 to 7 years. So you have no idea what's going to happen. It's always just a roll of the dice. But whatever
this
happens,
is a jury trial, right?
it is a
Okay.
jury trial. Yeah. So it's all, but I actually feel like if we were allowed to say whatever we wanted to the jury, I'd feel like almost 100% chance we're going to get acquitted. The problem is that's not the way courtrooms actually work,
Yeah,
especially when they involve very powerful industries that are pressuring judges and prosecutors, because judges are elected officials too. They're politicians for the most part in the United States, including Wisconsin. Um, but and the reason we wanted these cases wasn't just because of the attention, but because there's a legal principle at stake in these cases that is incredibly important that I hope more people learn about and try to defend in their own neighborhoods and communities. Because one of the lessons I've learned about the law, and I've been a lawyer for a long time, I was a law professor, but I learned this from one of the most distinguished judges in the United States. And what he said in his seminar was, law is not what's written on pieces of paper. Law is what happens on the streets, ultimately. And one concrete example actually involves personhood and people of color. Because for a long time in this country, the law on a piece of paper was that no person shall be deprived their life and liberty. But across the entire nation for 100 years, people just said, well, people of color aren't people, so it doesn't matter.
yeah,
I mean, there wasn't even a term people of color, but there's even a Supreme Court case that enshrined this. It's called the Dred Scott case, where they held, no, actually, black people who are slaves are just not people, so they don't get these rights. And what changed that wasn't just lawyers and people in robes and legislators writing things on pieces of paper. What changed that was a mass movement of a lot of people saying, hey, this is kind of messed up. And in particular, a lot of people saying, no, I think people are people. It's going to go ahead and save them. It was called the Underground Railroad because if we recognize this person has a right to liberty under the Constitution, then I'm going to defend the Constitution by giving this person their liberty. And a lot of people sacrifice a lot and die, for that idea. At stake in these cases is a very similar principle because what the prosecution has to convince the judge initially and then the jury is that these animals are just things. There's a doctrine of law called necessity that we're litigating in these cases. And the idea behind necessity is that when there is a person who is facing potentially great bodily injury or harm, you're just entitled to break the law to help them, right? If there's a dog in a hot car, you break the window, you take the dog out, and everyone recognizes, okay, whatever. It's just a window. Better to break a window than let a dog roast to death in a car. But that's like a very narrow example that we can enshrine in an entire legal system and start conversations about and probe the depths of people's moral convictions that animals are things. And I suspect that if we actually had that broader political conversation about whether animals are just things that you can roast to death in a factory farm or in a car, or you can use as a test tube by injecting with industrial chemicals to the point they vomit blood and convulse on the ground and die, most people are going to say, no, actually, that doesn't make any sense to me. The law that says that these animals are not beings that have any sort of legal recognition, that's got to be changed in some way. And the most important way it can change is just our understanding of the term person. So if we win this case, and again, by winning this case, I don't even mean getting acquitted, because it's possible we win by me getting thrown in jail. But there's a ton of conversations about the idea that it's wrong for someone to be in jail for recognizing that an animal is not just a thing, not just a test tube, but is a living being that deserves protection. We can shift the entire legal discourse and political discourse in this nation and around the world about whether animals are things or persons. And eventually the goal is to get to the point that a judge does agree with us and says, okay, there's enough of a popular movement out there, just like in the 1860s, this happened around the country, to the point that we amended the Constitution. The 13th Amendment was amended. It said, actually, no, slaves are people. And in fact, what was wrong is slavery, not the argument that slaves are people, but slavery itself was wrong. And similarly, I think if we can win some of these cases and cultivate political discourse around the idea that our most basic legal and political institutions are so corrupt and just so stupid, because every second grader understands that a dog is not a piece of garbage. Like, there's a difference. But we need more people talking about this and recognizing there is something fundamentally broken in our most basic institutions, the things that are telling all of us to do what we do, like the things that are commanding us to do this and not do that, or you'll go in jail, right? That has to change. And so that's a long way of making the point, which is these cases are super dangerous, and I've already been incarcerated once. Good chance I'll be incarcerated again over the next few years. But what's at stake here is a political principle that animates our entire nation in the United States, and really the entire common law, because it's not just a constitutional principle in the United States. It's a common law principle in all of the English-speaking world, and eventually, hopefully, in the entire world, that relates to the question of whether animals are just things or whether they're living beings that deserve legal rights. So that's just an idea that I think it's important for me to get out there, because I hope more people talk about this, because I think it's a good angle in just even your personal conversations to point out, do you know the legal system treats a dog no different than a test tube and a piece of garbage? And then when someone saw like a dog that was being tormented for years and months and took that dog to the vet, they're in prison because of how broken the system is. Even someone who's not vegan yet, they're probably going to get down on the idea, okay, that seems kind of disturbing.
Yeah.
Like, no dog, first of all, no dog should be treated like a test tube. But secondly, no one should go to prison and sit in a cage just because they took that dog to the vet.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So where can people find you?
Yeah, so go to simpleheart.org, and I'll be updating folks over the course of the trial, my personal newsletter. And I super, super appreciate you all signing up, subscribing, and following. And then you can go to righttorescue.com and follow the DXE campaigns around this. I'm not as involved around the campaigning, but I will be telling a lot of stories and will share with people any calls to action. But righttorescue.com and directactionever.com both have a lot of resources about the broader campaigns around this.
Okay, I'll be sure to put those links in the description so people can easily find you. All right, well, thanks for coming on and talking about the case and everything.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it, and keep up all the great work, and keep speaking truth, because that's one of the things I really admire about you and your channel, that you're one of the few, I think, who says what you think, which is, I wish that were not more rare, but I think unfortunately it's become a little rare, and we need to change that. We need people to say what they think.
All right, well, thanks.